On July 7, 2015, the Windsor Star ran an obituary for a 92-year-old man named Jack Hyatt, who lived in nearby Leamington, Ontario. When you read the obituary and see his kindly smiling face, you might think that this was just a wonderful old man who lived a wonderful old life. What you might not know is that this kindly old man, Jack Hyatt, was actually Crazy Jack Hyatt, the most notorious prison inmate in Michigan history, the man who led one of the biggest prison riots the country has ever seen and became the stuff of Hollywood legend. It seems like nobody knew who he really was when he passed away, but boy oh boy did this guy ever have a story. And this is the story of Crazy Jack Hyatt. This is Jackson Prison in southern Michigan. It was built way back in 1839, and at one time it was the largest walled prison in the world. There have been a lot of bad guys who spent time in Jackson, but the biggest event that ever took place here happened in 1952. Right behind those walls, a riot broke out on April 20th, 1952, that ended up being one of the biggest prison riots in American history. It started in cell block 15, the worst cell block in the prison, but it quickly spread to other parts of the prison. At one time, more than 2,600 prisoners were taking part in the riot. They were outside of their cells causing damage and taking guards hostage. The entire riot was started and led by two men, a drug dealer and armed robber from Detroit named Earl Ward, and a small-town crook from Canada named Jack Hyatt, who was better known to everyone as Crazy Jack Hyatt. But Crazy Jack's days as a legendary prisoner started long before he ever got to Jackson. The story actually starts on August 3, 1922, when Jack Hyatt was born in Leamington, Ontario, a small town on the banks of Lake Erie about 35 miles southeast of Windsor. He had a relatively normal childhood, but in 1938, at the age of 16, he officially became a convicted criminal when he and another kid stole some cash and merchandise from a local store in Leamington. When the cops started closing in on them, they set fire to their hideout. Those crimes landed Jack in the local juvenile jail for a term of 6 months. A couple years later, he landed in jail again when he stole some gasoline and then got caught without his national registration card, which was a crime in Canada. In 1941, when he was 19, he upped his game and started stealing cars and illegally carrying around a concealed weapon. This time, he got 2 years in a Canadian prison. He did his time for that, and when he got out, he started breaking into houses and stealing radium. That landed him in prison until 1945. And when he got out, he decided to see what American prisons were like. So he moved across the border into Detroit. In July of 1945, just as America was wrapping up a victory in World War II, Jack Hyatt and another guy were committing an armed robbery in Detroit. They held up a doctor named Eugene Robb in his house, stealing about $125 in cash along with some jewels. This was his first conviction in the States, and it was a serious one. The judge sentenced him to 25 to 30 years in the Jackson State Prison. Now, if you think that Jack Hyatt was just going to go quietly off to prison, well, you don't know Jack Hyatt. In September of 1945, two officers put Jack and another prisoner, a guy named Victor F. Milham, into the back of their squad car and started driving them from Detroit to Jackson so they could begin their prison sentences. When they got to Ypsilanti, though, the two prisoners decided it was time to make a break. They started kicking the back of the front seat violently, hoping the cops would crash the car and that they'd be able to escape. Well, the car did crash, and they were able to kick the hell out of one cop, breaking 4 of the fingers in his right hand. But the other cop was able to pull his gun and point it at Jack and Victor, telling them that if they didn't cut it out, they were both going to be shot. That ended the escape attempt. So off to prison he went, and 23-year-old Jack Hyatt, who had already done several terms in prison back in Canada, quickly started making a name for himself behind bars in Jackson. He caused problems for the guards every chance he got, and his unpredictable and wild behavior soon earned him a new nickname, Crazy Jack Hyatt. All the guards and all the prisoners and everybody started referring to him as Crazy Jack Hyatt. Well, in the late 1940s, Crazy Jack had caused so many problems in Jackson that they decided to transfer him to the state's other maximum security prison way up in Marquette. It was a cold and unforgiving place, located in the Upper Peninsula on the banks of Lake Superior. Throughout his criminal career, Crazy Jack had mostly just been famous locally, but his fame was about to spread worldwide. In July of 1950, word started to spread throughout the prison that Michigan's young new governor, G. Menon Williams, was going to come up to take a tour of the Marquette Branch prison. Governor Williams, who was better known as Soapy, was just 39 years old and had been elected to his first term in 1948. He was a Democrat and a diehard liberal, and he had a lot of sympathy for the men who were doing time in his prisons. He had heard the conditions were kind of rough in Marquette, so he wanted to head up to the prison to find out for himself. The problem was he didn't just drop in on the prison unannounced. He told everyone that he was coming. So that's when these three guys came up with their brilliant plan. They were going to kidnap Soapy Williams and then use him as a hostage to get out of prison. A foolproof plan, right? What could possibly go wrong? So that's exactly what Crazy Jack Hyatt and his two buddies, John Halstead and Ralph Stearns, tried to do. Soapy Williams came to the prison just as he said he would, and as he started walking through the kitchen as part of the inspection, the three cons sprung into action. Ralph Stearns pulled out a knife and then grabbed the governor and pulled him into a room just off the kitchen. Crazy Jack Hyatt grabbed a big onion masher and started swinging it around violently at the guards. He ended up connecting with one guard, breaking both of his arms. John Halstead then joined in, trying to jump the other guards. That's when the governor's bodyguard, George Kerr, stepped in. Nobody was supposed to have a gun inside the prison, but unbeknownst to anyone, Kerr had snuck one inside. So as the melee ensued, Kerr pulled out the gun and shot John Halstead in the stomach, killing him. He then pointed the gun at Crazy Jack and Ralph Stearns, telling them that they were next. At that point, the kidnap attempt was over. Ralph Stearns let the governor go, and Crazy Jack put down the onion masher, and everything went back to normal. What's really remarkable about the whole episode is that it didn't seem to faze Governor Soapy Williams one bit. That night, he drove over to a nearby banquet hall for a Democratic fundraiser, and he proceeded to tell the crowd all about it, and he really got into it. Here he is demonstrating to the crowd how Crazy Jack Hyatt came at him with the onion masher. And this poor guy had to sit there and listen to it. This is Albert Hawkness, the 67-year-old prison guard who had just had both his arms broken by Crazy Jack. With both his arms in a cast, he doesn't seem to be enjoying the story quite as much as Soapy Williams is. Now, back in those days, Michigan was holding elections for governor every 2 years, and Soapy Williams had another election coming up in the fall of 1950. So he decided to turn the attempted kidnapping into a political issue. He said the whole thing only happened because the Republicans in the legislature had cut prison funding so much. He was blaming the Republicans for this incident as much as he was blaming these three guys. Well, once the attempted kidnapping happened, the folks in Marquette decided that they didn't want Crazy Jack either, so they sent him back down to Jackson. And he laid low for a few months. But then in April of 1952, all hell broke loose once again. Crazy Jack had been placed in cell block 15, the worst cell block in the Jackson prison, and one of the first cons he met was a fellow armed robber from Detroit named Earl Ward. He was a charismatic guy with movie star good looks, and they hit it off right away. Now, the conditions in cell block 15 were pretty bad. The guys were rarely let out of their cells, and they had to eat all their meals alone in there, and they said the guards would occasionally beat them. So in April of 1952, Crazy Jack Hyatt and Earl Ward decided they'd had enough. They worked together with some other cons to overpower the guards and take over the cell block. The riots started on April 20th, 1952, and it quickly became the biggest news story in America. When word got out that Crazy Jack Hyatt and Earl Ward were the leaders of the riot, they became national celebrities, in a bad way. The rioters weren't looking to bust out of prison. They were just trying to get conditions improved in cell block 15 and the rest of the prison. They issued a list of 10 demands, and they said they were going to start killing their hostage guards one at a time if they didn't get their way. The riots started in cell block 15, but it quickly spread to other cell blocks until more than 2,600 cons were involved. Once the state police came, they got most of the other prisoners back in their cells, but the guys in cell block 15 were still holding hostages. Now, when the riots started, the warden did a few interesting things. One of them was that he invited all the newsmen to come inside the prison so that they could interview Earl Ward and Crazy Jack and the other rioters. The warden pretty much gave the reporters and photographers free rein to do whatever they wanted once they were behind the walls. A lot of people thought this was a horrible idea because all they were doing was making the prisoners even more famous. The newsreel photographers captured every bit of it, and there's no doubt that Earl Ward and Crazy Jack Hyatt were loving all the publicity.
Here at Michigan Penitentiary for 5 days, the world's largest walled prison is torn to pieces by maddened convicts who destroy everything they can put their hands on. Damage is estimated at $2.5 million.
The riot went on for several days, and it became much more violent as the state police shot and killed one inmate. Governor Williams was heavily involved at this point, the same Governor Williams who had come face-to-face with Crazy Jack Hyatt just 2 years earlier in Marquette. There was an assistant warden inside the prison who was doing most of the negotiating, and he was telling Soapy that the only way to stop more bloodshed was to give in, to basically just surrender. He told the governor that he should give in to every one of the rioters' demands. And that's exactly what Soapy Williams did. He gave in. He gave Crazy Jack Hyatt and Earl Ward everything they wanted. He surrendered. And not only that, but he also told the rioters that he would reward them with a big dinner of steak and ice cream once they let the guards go. The prisoners in the other cell blocks were eating cold sandwiches, but the rioters were dining out on steak and ice cream. Of course, this infuriated every single Republican in the state and a whole bunch of other people across the country, too. They couldn't believe that Governor Williams had surrendered to the rioters, saying that not only was it rewarding criminal behavior, but that it would only encourage even more riots. In any case, the bottom line is that Earl Ward and Crazy Jack Hyatt had done it. They had won. They were heroes to all the convicts in Jackson. So you're probably thinking at this point, Crazy Jack Hyatt and Earl Ward went back to their cells and became model prisoners and quietly served out the rest of their time. Well, that didn't exactly happen. What did happen is that they immediately moved Crazy Jack and Earl Ward out of Jackson Prison. They wanted to split them up and send them to a couple of county jails until everything calmed down. So they sent Earl Ward to the Livingston County Jail in Howell and Crazy Jack Hyatt to the Clinton County Jail in St. John's, north of Lansing. It took all of about 2 seconds for things to start going wrong in those two places. Over in Howell, Earl Ward was discovered with a blackjack in his cell and then went on a rampage, destroying the bed and towel rack and busting up the toilet. Up at the Clinton County Jail in St. John's, things were going even worse with Crazy Jack Hyatt. One time, he grabbed Sheriff Percy Patterson's arm and pulled it through the bars, trying to break it. Another time, he climbed up to the ceiling of the cell and hid there. His plan was to jump down and escape once a guard opened the door to see where he was. Crazy Jack ended up spending 13 months in the Clinton County Jail before they got tired of him there, too. He was running out of places to go, but they eventually decided they were going to send him back up to Marquette. Along about this time, Hollywood got a hold of the Jackson Prison riot story and decided to make a movie about it called Riot in Cell Block 11. It was very closely based on the events of the 1952 Jackson riot, and the characters of Earl Ward and Crazy Jack Hyatt were the stars of the film. All they did was change their names a bit. Crazy Jack Hyatt became Crazy Mike Carney.
Here's another one. Crazy Mike Carney. In for life. This is Don's pal. Transferred to us from the state mental hospital. I've been trying to get him transferred back with Don.
The movie was a huge hit, both commercially and with the critics. Even today, filmmaker Quentin Tarantino says it's the best prison film ever made.
Now, wait a minute. Let's let Dunn decide this.
All right. Get him.
And there was even a great story involving the actor who played Crazy Mike Carney, a tough guy actor named Leo Gordon. In real life, Gordon was an ex-con himself. He had done 5 years in San Quentin for armed robbery. Well, they were filming Riot in Cell Block 11 at Folsom Prison in California, and the warden there didn't want an ex-con involved in the production. So Leo Gordon had to agree to be strip searched every time he came into the prison for filming. In any case, Earl Ward and Crazy Jack Hyatt weren't just famous now. They were Hollywood famous. Back up in Marquette, meanwhile, Crazy Jack just kept on causing trouble. In 1954, he tried to break out of prison again, this time by whittling a fake gun out of wood. He was planning to use it to bust himself out, but the guards found it during a shakedown, and his plan was thwarted. Crazy Jack was only 32 years old at this point, and he'd spent almost his entire life behind bars. And based on his crimes and everything he had done in prison, you would have thought that he'd be an old man by the time he finally saw freedom. Instead, it only took 8 more years. That's right. In 1962, the state of Michigan decided that Crazy Jack Hyatt had done his time and they were going to set him free and send him back to Canada. Just 10 years after leading one of the biggest prison riots in U.S. history, just a dozen years after he tried to kidnap the governor, the state of Michigan was letting him go. Crazy Jack Hyatt was going to be a free man. People around the state couldn't believe it. Crazy Jack Hyatt was getting out of prison so soon? How was this possible? Well, the state said he had behaved himself for the past few years, and that knocked some time off the sentence. They said Crazy Jack had earned his freedom. Michigan's new governor, John Swainson, said Hyatt has served his time in Michigan. His release at this time seems to be a saving to the taxpayers of Michigan. The Kalamazoo Gazette saw it another way. They wrote in an editorial, Crazy Jack will be long remembered in Michigan in the worst kind of way. Now he's Canada's problem. When they let Crazy Jack out of prison in Marquette, 2 officers drove him to the border in Sault Ste. Marie. They drove him halfway across the bridge to the Canadian border and told him to never come back. 2 Canadian Mounties met him at that point, and they put him on a train for Leamington. And now you must be thinking that this is the part of the story where Crazy Jack Hyatt becomes totally rehabilitated. He's 40 years old, he gets out of prison, he sees the error of his ways, and he decides to stay on the straight and narrow. Well, again, that didn't exactly happen. Less than a year later, he found himself back in court for assaulting a woman and then trying to flee the police. He got 30 days in jail for that one. A year after that, he was convicted of running an illegal gambling house. And in 1970, he was convicted of assault yet again and given a fine. By the time his 50th birthday rolled around in the early 1970s, it seems that Crazy Jack Hyatt finally got tired of breaking the law and going to jail. He was having a good time back in Leamington, drinking and gambling and carrying on, but none of it was too illegal. In 1981, another riot broke out at the Jackson prison, and a reporter from the Windsor Star decided to drive out to 58-year-old Jack Hyatt's house to see what he thought about it. Jack was living on a ramshackle farm north of Leamington, and he spent several hours that day regaling the reporter with tales of his own prison days. That was the last time a reporter ever came out to interview Crazy Jack Hyatt. Many years later, in July of 2015, Jack Hyatt passed away at the ripe old age of 92. And even though there was this smiling obituary in the Windsor Star, not a single newspaper or TV station or radio station in Michigan or Canada did a story about him. Usually when somebody famous or infamous passes away, the media does a story about it. Well, not this time. Even though he was once the most famous prison inmate in America, the stuff of Hollywood legend, Crazy Jack Hyatt had been totally forgotten. In April of 2023, Jack Hyatt found himself being talked about one last time. On April 24th, 2023, his best friend passed away, a businessman from Leamington named Curly Clark. In the obituary, it mentioned that Curly's greatest joy in life was playing pool and shooting craps with his best buddy, the legendary Jack Hyatt. In his own obituary in 2015, it talked about all of Jack's good friends and family, and it also said, In keeping with Jack's wishes, no service will be held. That's too bad, because there would have been some stories to tell. And that's the story of Crazy Jack Hyatt.